Good morning, good evening to everyone. I'm delighted to be involved with this particular presentation because, we in Israel always say things are complicated. I would say that what I'm going to try and present today, this evening, is the ultimate of Israeli confusion and anger and controversy. And I could add a number of different words as well. The difference between, I think, being a modernist, which I am, which is kind of someone from the 1700s onwards, at least if you live in the Middle East, and people who take on earlier topics, is that when one deals with this particular topic, there are many, many people who are still alive. And so I would often find, having presented this before, that there'll be someone in the audience who, was involved in one of the slides, and that person would shout out and say, "You're misrepresenting it." By and large, my happiness is when most people shout out and say that this isn't everything of the story. And I always do say, in an hour or so, we can't do everything. And I would include that as well. The presentation is problematic in virtue of the fact that it's dealing with so many sub-issues. And my role here is to not cover everything. Obviously, we're talking about for period 904 to 1948, and some cases even a little bit after that. And you can't imagine the amount of material available and the amount of controversy. And I think this will come out as we're going through. I'm not going to describe absolutely everything you see on the screen, but just to give you a little bit idea of what the Jewish pre-state militias in it was Palestine initially, Eretz Israel, was all about. You can see all these little bits of red, different organizations, different things going on. And I think maybe the important thing is to look at the green, which gives us a sort of a macro picture. Firstly, we've got the Ottomans here until the First World War. The Ottomans were not friendly, to put it mildly. Just to add one point here, not only were they not friendly to the Jews, they were also very, very unfriendly to the local Arab population. Then comes the British mandatory government, and you'll see that's unbelievable inconsistency from both the Arab side and the Israeli side. At various times, the group would be delighted, and another time the group would be totally infuriated. Then we have the German threat. I won't go into that too much, but this played an important part for communities in northern Israel, around Haifa, for example, who at certain time we thought that the Nazis under Rommel, very powerful general, was going to take over. Then we have point number 4, where the Jewish population, my focus is on the Jewish population, is the Arab uprising, Palestinian uprising of 4 stages, 1922, 29, 36, 39, and then just before the creation of the State of Israel. Then we have the various aliyot, and then we have the various illegals, and you put inverted commas because that's what the British government called it, pre and post the Second World War. So that's sort of the big picture, the macro. Please don't expect yourselves to remember all the details, just to sort of get a feeling of complexity. So here we have the early Jewish militias. There were 2 groups, Bar Giora and Hashomer. The Bar Giora group called themselves the Shomrim, the guards, the watchmen. Took a very interesting title, Shimon Bar Giora, who was a Jewish military leader against the Romans in 66-70 CE. They were a fascinating group because, as you can see, if you look at the picture, they really did dress very much like the local Arab population. And this was a period that was early on in the Middle East complexity and conflict. But it was hoped by the Bar Giora that they would somehow or other establish a relationship with the Arab population by trying to be like them in one realm or the other. However, the reality were the conflicts. The local Arab population was very poor, and the whole area of the whole country was extremely poor. There were water problems. It really was a very, very deserted kind of country. Who would ever really want to come in here? And they were looking around at the Jews, and here they saw, for example, the Bar Giora getting organized, Westerners, better arms, and definitely a better understanding of the big wide world. So you have a local Arab population, some of them being here many, many generations, kind of being frustrated and really trying to get onto the same level as the Jewish settlements in particular, but having it pretty tough. Comes after that a continuation of the Hashomer, which we can see is a very small organization, 100 members in 13 settlements. Here we're talking essentially about kibbutzim. Kibbutzim had actually started at that time. Afterwards, we have the moshavim also. And the Hashomer, the guards, really wanted to just sort of keep active around the settlements itself. Really, they didn't go much more than that. And we can see the Hashomer carried on the Bar Giora approach of trying to take on Arab ways. We see the Arab dress, obviously, and to learn expressions in Arabic. They used this term, as we see in red, the new Jew. This was an amazing term. It meant so much, which we could actually spend a lot of time, which we won't. The new Jew was really an activist. A new Jew would be very, very different from the shtetl Jew. The shtetl Jew were looked at by these young militia people. They often between 17 and 23. And what they were really trying to do, and what they believed, and what their earlier ideology had told them to do, was the new Jew was going to be very different from the shtetl Jew. The image of speaking Yiddish, the clothing of the Yiddish Jews, and more than anything else, being very, very passive. The new Jew was going to be active. And in Jewish history, this was quite a jump. Jews had obviously been involved in certain militias over the years, but if you take a period of, say, 2,000 years or so, you'll find very, very few cases when Jews were militarily active. So the new Jew is a rejectionist kind of organization of the past. And if we speak about rejection, we have to mention that the people we're looking at there, in many cases, knew they were coming to this so-called Holy Land, or they didn't necessarily see it as quite so holy, but they in many, many cases realized that they would never see their parents again. This was a generation of young people who were out to change the world in terms of a Jewish sense. In quite a few of the slides, I've included a museum. We won't go into that in too much detail. I would kind of just include that if you ever do come to Israel and the presentation has been interesting, what you will find is that absolutely every one of the groups that we'll be talking about actually set up their own museum. And why would that be? Because in Israeli society, museums tell a powerful history, as they do in all countries, but each particular group wanted the story to be their own. And so that is why we don't have a museum of the pre-state militias. That wouldn't work, because these militias were very, very isolated, one from the other, in great levels of conflict, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. And this is why, when I got interested in this topic many years ago, I realized that my best textbook would not only be the vast number of written material, and we have some interesting movies, but rather to go to museum after museum and try and get into the mind of the particular group that we were talking about. Far Giladi is in the far part of the Israel. Then comes the First World War, and the First World War brings in a whole new range of challenges, because here we have a contradiction and a tension. The Jews, the Zion Mule Corps, it was not an independent organization. It was under the British control. And here we begin to see an ongoing event which will follow us through pretty much the next hour, and that is the tension between the British administration, and the British at this time have come into power after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and they were going to be led by people who had totally different ideas from the British. Firstly, we have Jabotinsky. We see a famous picture of Jabotinsky over here. He eventually became important in the Irgun and a very important ideologue for the revisionist party. Afterwards became the Likud party. We have Trumpeldor, a Russian, originally from Russia, lost an arm. He was the other. So we have kind of two people who quite early are aware of the importance of the military component, and once again, a fascinating phenomenon which exists until today, the support of Christian Zionists. Many Jews at this time were really very skeptical about the idea that there should be a Jewish state. I mean, how could it possibly happen? The Ottomans didn't agree with it, and certainly the British probably wouldn't. So, here the importance of the Christian Zionist is quite important. By 1915, the structure of the Zion Mule Corps changes to a certain extent, and we find here that the 650 Jewish volunteers were actually people who had been deported from Palestine, from Eretz Israel, to Egypt, initially by the Ottomans. That was controlled by the Egyptian government, very different from what it is today. But what they had then achieved was for them an unbelievable fact: a Jewish Star of David, a David emblem, and the flag. The Degel Yisrael, the idea of having the Jewish flag at this particular moment, was important. What is interesting about the Zion Mule Corps, who had a ghastly job, some of it was over there in Turkey, was that they were actually pushing wagons around all the time, and often in very, very dangerous situations. The Christian commander of that time of the Zion Mule Corps wrote the following afterwards: "They have shown great courage, taking supplies up to the line under heavy fire, and proved invaluable to us." Let us try and retain that sentence, because we're going to see a little later that while the British commander-in-chief speaks about the Zion Mule Corps as being invaluable, important words. By the way, the British decide on language very, very carefully. To say invaluable to us means that they really were very important. And there we see the picture of one of the early Zion Mule Corps groups, and we can see the flag and the emblem at an earlier stage. Things changed. 1917, the British control is totally in place. It had been around a bit before, but this is when it came in. And here comes the decision. Weizmann, Jabotinsky, and Trumpeldor took the people who had been in the Mule Corps before, and they were part of it, the Jewish Legion. Then there were British volunteers, interesting, coming straight from Britain. We'll speak about them at a later stage, who came in 1948. We have Russian Jews coming in who took a pretty large part. We had American Jews coming in, and we also had local Jews. And each of these Jewish groups were in different battalions. Important. We saw that the British commander in the earlier one said invaluable. What happened in the Jewish Legion, and this is just a change of a year or two, was the behavior of Allenby, General Allenby, who afterwards would play an important role in the takeover of Jerusalem. But the reality was that the maltreatment by the British soldiers, even though the Jews were in battalions next to them, not with them, but next to them, was going to be a tremendous shock to the people. The Jewish Legion, as you can see in the picture at the Western Wall, at the Western Wall, yeah. I try and keep it all in English, so I go to two languages. They there in the courtyard, and we see them sitting around waiting for the picture. Once again, a second, one of my favorite museums is actually the Jewish Legion, which is next to Netanya, and it gives a wonderful, wonderful story of the Jewish Legion. Here we come to some totally different story, and that's the Lehi story in itself, a amazing kind of event tied up with the Aronson family. There we see a picture of the Aronson family, a well-educated, wealthy family who actually decided to become loyal to the British. This was still, to take the early period, still during the Ottoman period. If the Ottomans had actually worked out just what Lehi had done totally, it would have been an absolute disaster. And in fact, certain members of the Aronson family did pay the price when it was still under Ottoman control. And this is what the population recognized, that in reality, it was one of the most dangerous intelligence operations in the history of the Jewish people. And the majority of the Jewish community, even after the First World War, were looked at what went on, and they decided that the way you have to deal with colonial power above you is not to get involved in power politics. And they were, Lehi as an organization, a small organization, was actually boycotted. Here we see their own museum, of course, up in Zichron Yaakov. Things get much more serious in 1920. It's as if, it's one epoch coming on to another. And that is the Arab unrest. Started in 1920, 21, and even a bit of 22, much less. And in 1921, the Arab unrest had brought about the killing of 90 Jews. In 1936, we see that there was something much larger, 36, 39. The British got involved, not against the Jews, but against the Arabs. In fact, in the Arab revolt of 36, 39, the Arabs at that time actually thought that the Jews were so much better than the British. But what happened to the Haganah is that in 1936, which was a much more powerful uprising by the local Arab population, they no longer used the word, which is a very important word in Hebrew, havlagah, which translated into restraint. Here, whereas they looked at the early organizations as being kind of pretty soft, here they wanted to really be an army, a part-time army. There was no doubt about it. When we talk about in 1937, 17,000 men and 4,000 women, it doesn't mean we've got 17,000 men walking around in uniform and 4,000 women doing the same, but rather these were people in many cases working on kibbutzim or moshavim or even in the city, and they would just carry on their regular life, and often their activities was a weekend, or they would be called up for a few days, not much more than that, but they really were pretty much regular citizens who were very part-time. Some of the advances of the Haganah, and this is once again a jump from the military understanding of the earlier groups, was a fascinating Christian gentleman, Ord Wingate, who came to look at what the Haganah was all about, realized that this group really hadn't got it all worked out. He had already had experience by military activity in Asia, and he established the special night squads and guerrilla fighting, a totally different way of looking at it. He was a pro-Jewish statehood man, he was a pro-Zionist, and he changed the whole nature of fighting in the night, whereas the Arab population at that period had definitely not done it. And it brought within it a whole advancement. The things seem to be okay. Ord Wingate is helping the Jews. That's pretty great. Then October 1939, beginning of the Second World War, just before, the British attempt to disarm the Haganah. So that means you've got the start of a relatively well-organized Jewish military philosophy. And then the British come along and they arrest half of the officers' training course. So let us think in our own minds. You know, my way of understanding history is I have to get into the minds of everyone. And I'm kind of getting my mind at this moment into these young officers who for the first time in their life may well be feeling that now we are real soldiers, and yet they find themselves arrested by the British government. Then look what's happened in 1940. A little time afterwards, the British recruit the Haganah. You've jailed them, now you're recruiting them. What's going on here? And by this time, the figure is 11,000 people as full-time soldiers, essentially for the Second World War. We find that in the period of 1942, Rommel has this threat to Egypt, which was believed would then overflow to Palestine, to Eretz Israel, which didn't happen. And by 1943, it was clear that Rommel was no longer the threat. But what's happening? In 1943, the British government come in after having the Kentish Royal Fusiliers fighting with the British Army, and there were lengthy imprisonment for possession of arms or bullets. Pretty clear. Summer 1944, the war ended in May 1945. The formation of the Brecha, it's an amazing organization where people realized that at this time the German government German army was very much on decline. Jews were starting to manage to get out of certain closed areas. And that was when these people, many of them soldiers, by the way, many of these were Haganah people, instead of when they could have come back to their homes, stayed there and started slowly but surely to try and bring Jews from Europe, often on their backs, often on the Italian mountain areas. And we have pictures of them carrying sometimes 3 or 4 children in their hands over the high mountains. And the Haganah, as we see it over here in Tel Aviv, has a good story about that. 1945, we have, it's a technical thing, the Mossad and the Haganah come together. And in August 1945, we begin to see what the Brecha and other organizations are faced with. August 1945, there are 55,000 displaced persons camped waiting for the exit permits to Palestine. By the way, that figure eventually got to 250,000 as time went on. Jews and, by the way, gypsies, Romas, also were looking for a place to go. The Jews had nowhere to go. The countries, by and large, were not accepting. There were some obviously different advantages to America and England and a few other places, but essentially nowhere to go. They have been, in many cases, in concentration camps. They get out of the concentration camps. They put in displaced persons camps in Europe, in Central Europe, and then they wait for a considerable time. In fact, some of them were there until 1948 to try and get a permit to come to Palestine. October the 10th, 1945, the British set up the Atlit detention camp. We can see the Jewish vote, the Haganah ship, Jewish state, that was one of the big ships that came in. There were many others. And here we see a picture of, once again, when I look at the pictures of a Holocaust camp, which was opened by the British or the Americans, and the barbed wire, and then they'd gone into displaced persons camps, barbed wire, and then they come to the Atlit detention camp once again with barbed wire. Quite something. The Haganah works very hard and eventually gets to once again an impressive figure of maybe as many as 60,000. Unlike the Haganah, which, as I mentioned, was kind of a few days a week, a weekend, or whatever it's going to be, a very kind of low level of military activity. From 1941, and this is clearly influenced by what was going on in Europe and understanding of just how dangerous the world was. The world was not good to the Jewish people. I won't make any comment about the contemporary reality, but it's the development of the Palmach. The Palmach, the strike force, was very different from the Haganah. They looked at themselves as different. They were quite elitist. Very interesting. They were kind of very left people in those days and left in their ideology, and yet very active. So we have this kind of interesting interaction. They had a whole culture of themselves, their poems written about the Palmach and songs. There were stories about flowers and things like that, all among the atmosphere of very committed military people, initially small, 2,000 men and women. By the way, this is really the moment, I can't say that full egalitarianism came into the country, but I can certainly say that the women in the Palmach had an almost equal sense of what was going on. I know I've looked deeply into this, and I know it's an almost, it's nowhere near full, but that was even an important event. The first commander was Yitzhak Sadeh. And once again, who is Yitzhak Sadeh? He's a soldier, he's an officer, he's a writer, and he's an educator. So this gives us a kind of a rounding of the Palmach. When I came to Israel some 56 years ago, one of the first people I managed to talk to, because I was early on interested in the topic, were people who had been in the Palmach. And it was fascinating listening to them. They were, at this time in their lives, they were maybe 20, 21 years old. And, I would often ask, well, what did it feel like to be a Palmach person? And I remember the very first person I ever met said, Palmach, you have to ask me what it's to be a Palmach. You kind of, how could one even question what the Palmach were all about? What was interesting was 1942. 600 Palmach people, and this was really why the Palmach was quickly developed in a much more sophisticated way than the Haganah, were trained by British experts. They were helped the British against Vichy, the Nazis in Lebanon and Syria, and the British realized that the Palmach would be very important against if there was a German invasion. A little later, it was taken on by Yigal Allon. We see in 1945, they liberated 208 people from Atlit. We can see that this is very active. The story of the Palmach, which is going after the constraints of this particular session, was that the tensions between David Ben-Gurion and Yigal Allon and the Palmach people meant that the Palmach people, who would really have been some of the best senior officers we could have had, by 1950 resigned very much because of conflicts between people who actually have pretty similar ideological perspectives, but are actually looking at the world in a different way and in other senses. We here come to a totally different situation. If I was in an audience where some of the people were the Haganah crowd, they said this was good. This is who we are. And if they were Palmach people, said, thanks, Paul, you've done a pretty good job in representing our group. Things become much, much more complex with the growth of the Irgun. And here it's up and down in nuance and very, very tense issues. So I'll just spend a little bit more on this particular one. Jabotinsky, who had been in the Haganah initially, he was given 15 years imprisonment and deportation because he had been found with weapons. He was eventually released very quickly by the High Commissioner, and he later on formed the Revisionist Party and the Beitar Youth Movement. 1931, we start what becomes, I would say, almost a continuing Israeli mania, to use the expressions, of forming and breaking. I often, when I'm trying to understand contemporary Israeli politics, and even trying to remember the names of the various political parties from January 1949 till today, we actually see that this fragile division between different Jewish groups in crisis. This is the heartbreaking thing. But in 1931, the Haganah was looked at by the Irgun, particularly the Irgun in Jerusalem, who were very active, a 3,000 strong active group. They broke off, but in a very short time, the leader of the Irgun at that time and half the members returned to Haganah. So you in Haganah, you go to Irgun, something goes wrong in Irgun, you go back to Haganah. By the way, when you go back to Haganah, do the Haganah really look at you as legal, as sort of loyal to their particular point of view? There were 4 major events in Irgun history, which is totally involved with the then much larger labor movement and the Haganah and the Palmach and the general left of Israel, which start to exist. It's the Histadrut and other organizations. Firstly, we have the Saison, which is probably the most controversial event, I would say, even pretty much up till today. The Labour Party, Ben Gurion, the Haganah and the Palmach, as the Second World War was ending, began to recognize that, we've had trouble with the British. It hasn't been easy with them. Sometimes they've even arrested us and detained us. But we have to have the British somewhat on our side. That is very much what happened. And the Irgun were totally against it. The Irgun saw the British as essentially their enemy, their major enemy. And the Haganah and the Palmach said, no, this is going too far. And therefore, the Haganah and the Palmach handed over a certain number of the Irgun to the British. It's obvious to all of us the issue that then comes up. And if I can jump ahead many, many years, that when Yitzhak Rabin, who had actually been involved in that, was assassinated, there were articles in the newspaper and just people talking, saying he deserved it. This is the punishment that he is getting for having been part of the Saison. 1,000 Irgun members found themselves either in the Latrun detention camp in the middle of the country or were sent to North Africa. July 1956, a major controversy. Here we see the picture of the King David Hotel. The controversy, I won't even start to try to pull it apart. The Irgun basic concept was we put a phone call through to the main office of the King David Hotel. They didn't get out. Tough luck. The tough luck is that Jews, Arabs, and British were killed in that event. The left wing, the Haganah and the Labour Party people say this was random, you should never have done it, and you are directly responsible. We have Deir Yassin, a small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Just as you come into Jerusalem, it's not really visible today, but you would have seen it. The Irgun went into Deir Yassin and killed whatever number you want, somewhere between 100 and 200 local people, so it is said. It is maintained by the Irgun that as a result of the Deir Yassin event, there was a mass Arab flight, which means the Arab population quickly became much weaker than it was. They were leaving the country, something like maybe between 500,000 and 700,000 people may or may not have gone away. Then we have this Altalena. Here we can see the Altalena case. Altalena was the writing word of Jabotinsky. Here's the Altalena come in. The Altalena was under the control of the revisionist Irgun group. They're bringing this boat in. The leftist controlling group in this country was terribly afraid that this Altalena group was bringing arms which would be given only to the Irgun, and therefore the Irgun would be a very powerful organization fighting in a very active way, much more than the Haganah and the Palmach may have agreed to, against the Arab and the British. Very tough, complex. Eventually we see the Altalena goes up in flames. A small number, I think it was 17 members of the Irgun was killed, and some 3 or 4 of the Haganah. The Irgun, the Etzel, has in fact 2 museums. The anger appears in the museums, and the later one on the sea coast of Tel Aviv is actually very, very nicely done. Now we come to another extreme group. This is a small, tiny group. What is it? I put at the bottom, it seems to be that there were actually 300 active members, and then there was some sort of support in one way or the other, very part-time members of the Lehi who were a kind of a secret underground. I've spent a lot of time trying to get real figures here. And even in the Lehi Museum, which we see over here, which is in a little street of Tel Aviv, it's really very hard to get the real facts. The interesting thing about the Lehi, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, is the personality of Abraham Yair, the spark, the leader, in many ways, Stern, who writes in a poem. He was a philosophy student at the Hebrew University. We were all recruited for life. Only death releases from the ranks. Very, very powerful. A split. Lehi is a split in 1940 from the Irgun. Wow. The British, they say, are the real enemy and not the Germans. By the way, Irgun didn't say it like that. They saw the enemy as the local enemy. They saw the Germans as the external, very important enemy. Here it's a different kind of language. In fact, they wanted an alliance with the Nazis. Let me tell you, when I've been in certain groups and I've used Lehi material and I've quoted this, people in the group would literally stand up and say, this is Haganah propaganda, except it was. The Stern was looked at by a major threat. He was a very powerful one. Just let's look even at it is what he wrote once again. Even we, small in numbers though we be, can faithfully fulfill this one specific role that is our historical mission. Well, he was caught in this building on the top floor by a British detective. Lehi people killed Lloyd Moyne. They killed Count Bernadotte. And they didn't disappear. I would say they didn't disappear from the Israeli psyche. You can find even today the radical right group thinking, if not using these exact words, sometimes, not saying all of them, sometimes very much enthused by the Lehi. And the Lehi, by the way, have an annual event where they get to meet each other. I'm going to go quickly today because I certainly want you to have questions. There's the other component of 1.5 Jews in the Allies and Soviet armies. Fascinating story, and for any of you who do come here, the recent Museum of the Jewish Soldier in World War II, Latrun, is remarkable. I think it's the best museum that I've seen in Israel, and we've got a lot. We're not short of museums here, but it was really unbelievable what they managed to pull together. And this is the story essentially of the people, the vast number of Jews who were involved in the Second World War. 1.5 million Jews were there. Many of them were involved in the Brecha. Once again, we see that that idea again. But what was the fear of the British? The fear was that the Jewish Brigade, in those of them in the Second World War, would become a fighting force in the Haganah, and their fear was totally legitimate. Towards the end, just let us look at what happened in terms of the political structure. The UN Partition Plan, November 29, 1947, was this map. What could well have happened if other events hadn't come into play was that the state of Israel would officially be recognized as this small part of the Galilee. Here there was the majority of the Arabs, very thin level of the coastal plain, going down into Beersheba, initially not even this part, but there was the influence of people like Truman, so at least got all the way to Aqaba, the Alpha Aqaba Eilat. Therefore, all the yellow.
Well, we can't see your cursor, so can you just mention which?
Sorry.
Looking at the right-hand map or the left hand?
Can you see it now? Is it appearing on the screen?
Yes, no. Now we can see it.
Okay, sorry, the complex, we've got two screens here. So thank you so much for telling me. So here we have, this is the brown, Jewish. Okay, not a lot, about 20%. Here we've got Arab, and here we got the UN headquarters, which was, there was a belief that Jerusalem would be a united city with Bethlehem under international control. Well, what eventually happened was there was a war. November 1947, the local Arab population starts attacking the Jewish pre-state, the Jewish Yeshuv. The locals were not exceptionally powerful. With the creation of the State of Israel in May 14th, 1948, there was a battle. The Israeli army won for a whole lot of good reasons. And this map that we are seeing here is that the red is what was given to us by the League of Nations, which afterwards became the UN. Sorry, it was the UN at this time. The additional area, that was the blue, sorry, the blue was the original one. The additional fighting, the reds, were what Israel took up to the top here in the war, November 47 to January 1949. Here we see Gaza, which was taken over by Egypt. Here we see the West Bank, Judea and Samaria in Hebrew, taken over by the Hashemite, the Jordanian government. And once again, we see the international city that was coming from here. We can see what's happening here. 4,700 Machalniks, people from Machal, who were Jews from around the world, came from 56 countries to help the state of Israel. I've been asked again and again and again, how is it that there are so many people, so many Jews fighting in the Second World War, and yet really not actually getting in, not coming around when we really needed them? I believe that Jewish soldiers had been absolutely exhausted. That was a long, long war, 39-45, and they went home and they had all the rights to go back to their homes and settle. There was also, by the way, the Gachal, 1947, Gachal, and another group. Machalniks could stay here or go back. Gachal people would tend to stay here, but one statistic which is remarkable: in the displaced person camps, people from the displaced persons camps who came to Palestine, Israel, were between 1/2 and 1/3 of the fighting force. Gosh, just out of displacement camps in Germany, sometimes being in Atlit, get out of Atlit, join the Israeli army, given in some cases, those who came on the boats, by the way, were given 2 weeks training, military training, which is not much, and obviously many, many deaths, which we know from the cemetery at Har Herzl next to Yad Vashem. We know, looking around Har Herzl, how many burials there are where we don't know their names, we don't know anything about them, we don't know when they were born, we probably wouldn't even know when they died. Sometimes you have Moshe or something like that. This was a real tough situation. 1% of the Israeli population died in the Israel War of Independence, most of whom were very young people. And just to end, this is a picture of the war. The war was confusing, unlike anything else. These are the soldiers fighting in 47 to 49. This is an old tank. It's an interesting story. This is up in the north. And here we have the museum, which I mentioned earlier. In Hebrew here, the Museum of the Jewish Soldier. If you do have a chance sometime to go and see it, I recommend. I've just gone a bit over the time, but I'll share my screen now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to start with, I'm going to go directly into questions as we have quite a few. And the first one is the English name of militia and the connotations that it gives, because it's different from or it's a specific translation of the Hebrew word machtarot. Which can very often is translated into organization or underground organization rather than militia.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, the reason why I've used the word militias is that it really stopped being an underground organization. The Haganah was above ground. The Palmach was above ground. The Irgun was above ground. So the underground, I think, is an English term which kind of says it's not the army or sort of all secret. That's why I do prefer the term militias. The militias, really, these are a malicious force. The British, we find the British accepted them as a militia. If they were underground, I couldn't imagine that any government would have accepted them. But as a militia, they needed them. Sometimes they jailed them, and other times they used them. If you're fighting in the First World War, the Second World War, you're fighting as a armed militia person. So that would be my explanation.
Thank you. There were a few questions and comments regarding the bombing at King David Hotel, one of them claiming that Haganah was also involved, even though they tried to wash their hands completely from it. Can you say a few words about that?
The Haganah was initially in the plan. But at a certain time, when the decision was really had to be made, they stopped it. They said very, very clearly, this is not what we're not going to do. This is where the person who asked the question is you're absolutely right. The one perspective is that when it was clear that the King David Hotel should not be attacked, and it would be very, very dangerous, and they told the Irgun, don't do it. This is impossible. The Irgun said, well, we're not going to cause any great damage because we're going to tell, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to tell the telephonist in the hotel that they're about to be attacked, and they would therefore leave. You know, there is so much in the period that we're talking about where the nuance of one group and the other group is almost impossible to understand. You know, for myself, I kind of come from a strange background. I was in the Habonim leftist socialist youth movement for part of my life. And in my latest stage of school and even a bit of university, I was in Beitar. I was in the revisionist group. So, you know, I kind of at various times identified with different things. And when I came to Israel and I kind of tried to pull things together, it wasn't that it was a political issue, but I really did try as much as possible to give the two versions. I can understand absolutely why people who were in the Irgun are totally furious if they do believe that this was really a Haganah Palmach activity and they're to be blamed for it. By the way, in the case of Deir Yassin, it's a totally Irgun phenomenon. So, you know, it works in a different way.
Another question was, how did the Palmach, or why did the Palmach get all the halo, like the halo and fame that we learn about, and it didn't happen with the Haganah and everything? What was their
the Haganah? Well, you know, the Haganah were sort of schleppy soldiers, you know, weekend sort of people. They were kind of, you know, useful, and they tried and they were learning and things like that. The Haganah was not an army. It was a collective of armed people. The Palmach was an army. The Palmach, 1941, becomes an army. We have the Yigal Allon. We have a lot of other officers who became very important in Israeli history. They really were an army. This was, by the way, that the British were a bit angry with the Haganah, but they were very frightened of the Palmach. They needed the Palmach more than the Haganah because of their military ability. The aura comes because here it's a military organization with a cultural ambience. You know, the poetry and the thinking and the discussions they had. They were a very, very well coerced in their own wishes to create something more than they kind of fairly weak organization like the Haganah. The question is amazing because when I spoke to Haganah people and then I spoke to Palmach people, I could always feel the difference. You could feel it. You could, it might be in some ways, even what we have in the Israeli army, there's certain units which you might be 20, 30 units where a soldier might say, I'm in one of the Sayeret. What's a Sayeret?
I don't know how to translate that. Let me check.
English, a kind of a leadership front force. I'm in one of the 5 of them. And people would say, oh, your jaw would kind of drop. That's true with the Air Force as well, by the way. I'm a pilot. Well, that's it. And then many thousands of other soldiers are just not into that same ambience. So I think this is what happens. By the way, this is not unique in any way to Israel. You find this in all armies, in the British Army and then the American Army. You find it very, very much the same kind of model.
Thank you. This is a good segue for another question that we received, that do any of these militias have an echo in the specific brigades of the IDF today?
Good question. I think yes. I think the Israeli army is increasingly coming under people who would have identified with the Irgun. I know I was in 2 different regions, 2 different fields of the army in my reserves. I was in communications, and then I was in education. And in the education unit at that time, I was very, very much aware that we could say anything we wanted. They said, please don't go into politics. Please don't cause tension between the soldiers, but you're absolutely free to say anything you want. What I hear from people in the education unit today, it's much more strictly controlled. And this is a result, we talk in politics, this is a result of a prime minister who's been in power plus minus 16 years and has a tremendous power. He's formed a major control of this country. And therefore, by definition, while he would be putting his people in various ministries and other places and other governmental influenced NGOs, it also certainly has entered the Israeli army as well. We as Israelis, we're always connected to the army. I was there, 4 children were there, 2 of them were officers. Recently, 2 months ago, 2 of our grandsons there, 3 of our granddaughters came out a little while ago. We're so close to the army that I think we get a pretty good feel of the changing army. And this is my understanding of it.
Thank you, Paul. We're at the top of our time, but I will ask last thing, and we will send a follow-up email with more reading material and the recording. But if you had to choose 1 or 2 books that you'd say are the ones to read about this topic, what would they be?
I would suggest a book which isn't only about the topic, because I've taken just a slice of Israeli society out for obvious reasons. But I think people who are trying to understand what was really going on should read the historical book by Anita Shapira, Shapira, who I can't remember the exact, it's something about the story of Israel, one of those sort of titles. I think our Israeli historians are excellent, and I think very, very honest. I think Anita Shapira is a useful book to read, because I think it's true she's a Labour Party member. I think she writes as much as you can with a lack of bias, minimal. We all have bias, but she doesn't push it forward. And I think it's when we understand the big picture of the pre-state what I've been speaking about comes into it. It's a important, very important chapter, but I think the need to understand Israel. The thing that I like about the book, by the way, she also wrote a very good book on Ben Gurion. I think this is, and I said at the beginning, this is such a complex country. There are so many confusing things. And I found Anita Shapiro's book, even having read it many years after I'd done earlier studies, I think she gives us a good idea. And then I think you understand the background of those very people we were talking about, from the Haganah to the Hashomer, and all the others that I'd mentioned. So that would be my recommendation. I think I sent to you, Cyril, some time ago, the book list. I hope it's
Yes, it's there, and you're talking about Israel, a History by Anita Shapira. She is
the
one of
one.
my
Thank
favorite
you.
writers, so we'll include her and many other reading materials in the follow-up email. I must say that even though this is an online session, so no one in the room could stand up and shout at you, but people were shouting at me in the chat. So you did your job well and misrepresented almost everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone had something to say about what you were saying. Thank you everyone for participating in the chat. I hope I asked most of your questions, even not if all. Paul, thank you so much for taking us through this journey.
I just thought one thing. If you're interested, I no pressure, but I see, Cyril, you always give the what am I going? The post, I've got a black.
The follow-up notes?
The follow-up notes and the details of my Gmail. Sorry, that's what I was looking for, the Gmail.
So are you welcoming people to argue with you?
I am welcoming you to argue with me. And I must say that I take arguments against me very, very seriously, even though I don't think you're always right.
Beautiful. Okay. So, Paul, thank you. I love that. I'll include your email in our follow-up. If there's anything interesting that develops, please let me know. Thank you, everyone, for being such an engaged audience. It's a pleasure. It's good to see you. Have a good day, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are.
And I'm seeing lots of faces that I remember. Well, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. That's very encouraging. So far, but so close.